Ancient Egypt was an ancient civilization of eastern North Africa, concentrated along the northern reaches of the Nile River in what is now the modern country of Egypt. The civilization coalesced around 3150 BC with the political unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the first pharaoh, and it developed over the next 3 millennia. Its history occurred in a series of stable kingdoms, separated by periods of relative instability known as intermediate periods. Ancient Egypt reached its pinnacle during the New Kingdom, after which it entered a period of slow decline. Egypt was conquered by a succession of foreign powers in this late period, and the rule of the pharaohs officially ended in 31 BC when the early Roman Empire conquered Egypt and made it a province. Although the Egyptian military forces in the Old and Middle Kingdoms were well maintained, the new form that emerged in the New Kingdom showed the state becoming more organized to serve its needs. For most parts of its long history, ancient Egypt was unified under one government. The main military concern for the nation was to keep enemies out. The arid plains they wanted to get rid of and deserts surrounding Egypt were inhabited by nomadic tribes who occasionally tried to raid or settle in the fertile Nile River Valley. The Egyptians built fortresses and outposts along the borders east and west of the Nile Delta, in the eastern desert, and in Nubia to the south. Small garrisons could prevent minor incursions, but if a large force was detected, a message was sent for the main army corps. Most Egyptian cities lacked city walls and other defenses. The history of ancient Egypt is divided into 3 kingdoms and 2 intermediate periods. During the 3 kingdoms, Egypt was unified under one government. During the intermediate periods, government control was in the hands of the various nomes and various foreigners. The geography of Egypt served to isolate the country and allowed it to thrive. This circumstance set the stage for many of Egypt's military conquests. They enfeebled their enemies by using small projectile weapons, like bows and arrows. They also had chariots which they used to charge at the enemy. The Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom was one of the most prosperous times in Egypt's history. Because of this affluence, it allowed the government to stabilize and in turn organize a functioning military. Before Egypt's New Kingdom, there were 4 major causes for military conflict: the Libyans from the Sahara to the west, the Nubians from the south, the Sinai and Canaanites to the north. Internal conflict when the regions, or nomes, divided from the monarchy to form rival factions. All of the areas outside Egypt were connected in conflict either by raiding parties entering Egypt or Egypt maintaining a policy of eradication. Imperialism. The Old Kingdom's military was most marked by the construction of forts along the Nile River. At this time, the main conflict was with Nubia, and Egypt felt the urge to defend their borders by building forts deep into this country. These forts were never actually attacked, but they acted as a deterring factor towards potential invaders. Many are currently underwater in Lake Nasser. But while they were visible, they were a true testament to the affluence and military prowess of ancient Egypt during this time. During the Old Kingdom, there was no professional army in Egypt. Governors of each nome had to raise their own volunteer army. Then, all the armies would come together under the pharaoh to battle. Because the army was not a very prestigious position, it was mostly made up of lower-class men, who could not afford to train in other jobs. Old Kingdom soldiers were equipped with many types of weapons, including shields, spears, cudgels, maces, daggers, and bows and arrows. The most common Egyptian weapon was the bow and arrow. During the Old Kingdom, a single arched bow was often used. This type of bow was difficult to draw, and there was less draw length. After the composite bow was introduced by the Hyksos, Egyptian soldiers used this weapon as well. The Middle Kingdom. In the Middle Kingdom, the theory of equilibrium imperialism really began to develop. Egypt's control of the surrounding territories became something that the military was forced to be directly involved in. They needed to control their own borders for several reasons. First of all, Egypt was protecting her own strength, land, and resources. Also, she needed to control trade routes so Egypt could continue to be wealthy and powerful. Borders were also expanded during this time. The second intermediate period, after Menpera I fled his palace at the end of the 13th dynasty, a Canaanite tribe called the Hyksos sacked Memphis and claimed dominion over Upper and Lower Egypt. After the Hyksos took control, many Egyptians fled to Thebes, where they eventually began to oppose the Hyksos rule. The Hyksos, Asiatics from the northeast, set up a fortified capital at Avaris. The Egyptians were trapped at this time. Their government had collapsed. They were literally in the middle of an enemy sandwich, between the Hyksos in the north and the Kushite Nubians in the south. This period marked a great change for Egypt's military. The Hyksos brought with them to Egypt the horse, the chariot, and the composite bow. These tools drastically altered the way Egypt's military functioned. The Hyksos introduced the Ureret to the Egyptians. Although the Hyksos have been credited with these introductions, a fragment from a stela shows Khonsway Mwiset, son of Pharaoh Dudimos, one of the last rulers of the 13th dynasty, with a pair of chariot gloves under his seat, which denote his status as master of the horse. Clearer evidence for the use of horses in the early SIP comes from Tel el-Kabir, where Ali Hassan had excavated the complete skeleton of a horse, which he has dated, from associated finds, to the 13th dynasty. Kanawati has also uncovered a 12th dynasty tomb at el-Rakakna containing an object engraved with the head of a horse. The chariot was not invented by the Hyksos but was introduced in the north by the Hurrians. The composite bow allowed for more accuracy and kill distance with arrows. These advances ultimately worked against the Hyksos because they allowed the Egyptian military to mobilize and oust them from Egypt, beginning when Seqenenretau became ruler of Thebes and opened a struggle that claimed his own life in battle. Seqenenre was succeeded by Kamose, who continued to battle the Hyksos, before his brother Ahmose was finally successful in driving them from Egypt. This marked the beginning of the New Kingdom. In the New Kingdom new threats emerged. However, the military contributions of the Hyksos allowed Egypt to defend themselves from these foreign invasions successfully. The Hittites hailed from further northeast than had been previously encountered. They attempted to conquer Egypt, yet were defeated and a peace treaty was made. Also, the mysterious Sea Peoples invaded the entire ancient Near East during this time. The Sea Peoples caused many problems, but ultimately the military was strong enough at this time to prevent a collapse of the government. The Egyptians were strongly vested in their infantry, unlike the Hittites who were dependent on their chariots. It is in this way the New Kingdom army was different than its two preceding kingdoms, Old and Middle Kingdom armies. Before the New Kingdom, the Egyptian armies were composed of conscripted peasants and artisans, who would then mass under the banner of the pharaoh. During the Old and Middle Kingdom, Egyptian armies were very basic. The Egyptian soldiers carried a simple armament consisting of a spear with a copper spearhead and a large wooden shield covered by leather hides. A stone mace was also carried in the Archaic period, though later this weapon was probably only in ceremonial use, and was replaced with the bronze battle axe. The spearmen were supported by archers carrying a simple curved bow and arrows with arrowheads made of flint or copper. No armor was used during the 3rd and early 2nd millennium BC. Foreigners were also incorporated into the army. Nubians entered Egyptian armies as mercenaries and formed the best archery units. New Kingdom armies. The major advance in weapons technology and warfare began around 1600 BC when the Egyptians fought and finally defeated the Hyksos people who had made themselves lords of Lower Egypt. It was during this period the horse and chariot were introduced into Egypt, which the Egyptians had no answer to until they introduced their own version of the war chariot at the beginning of the 18th dynasty. The Egyptians then improved the design of the chariot to suit their own requirements. That made the Egyptian chariots lighter and faster than those of other major powers in the Middle East. Egyptian war chariots were manned by a driver holding a whip and the reins and a fighter, generally wielding a composite bow or, after spending all his arrows, a short spear of which he had a few. The charioteers wore occasionally scale armor, but many preferred broad leather bands crossed over the chest or carried a shield. Their torso was thus more or less protected, while the lower body was shielded by the chariot itself. The pharaohs often wore scale armor with inlaid semi-precious stones, which offered better protection, the stones being harder than the metal used for arrow tips. The principal weapon of the Egyptian army was the bow and arrow. It was transformed into a formidable weapon with the introduction by the Hyksos, the composite bow. These bows, combined with the war chariot, enabled the Egyptian army to attack quickly and from a distance. Other new technologies included the khopesh, which temple scenes show being presented to the king by the gods with a promise of victory, body armor. In the 19th dynasty, soldiers began wearing leather or cloth tunics with metal scale coverings, and improved bronze casting. Their presence also caused changes in the role of the military in Egyptian society, and so during the New Kingdom, the Egyptian military changed from levy troops into a firm organization of professional soldiers. Conquest of foreign territories, like Nubia, required a permanent force to be garrisoned abroad. The encounter with other powerful Near Eastern kingdoms like Mitanni, the Hittites, and later the Assyrians and Babylonians, made it necessary for the Egyptians to conduct campaigns far from home. Over 4,000 infantry of an army corps were organized into 20 companies between 200 and 250 men each. There were also companies of Libyans, Nubians, Canaanite and Sherdans who served in the Egyptian army. They were often described as mercenaries, but they were most likely impressed prisoners who preferred the life of a soldier instead of slavery. Late period armies. The next leap forwards came in the later period, when mounted troops and weapons made of iron came into use. After the conquest by Alexander the Great, Egypt was heavily Hellenized and the main military force became the infantry phalanx. The ancient Egyptians were not great innovators in weapons technology, and most weapons technology innovation came from Eastern Asia and the Greek world. Military organization. As early as the Old Kingdom, Egypt used specific military units, with military hierarchy appearing in the Middle Kingdom. By the New Kingdom, the Egyptian military consisted of three major branches: the infantry, the chariotry, and the navy. Infantry troops were partially conscripted, partially voluntary. Egyptian soldiers worked for pay, both natives and mercenaries. Of mercenary troops, Nubians were used beginning in the late Old Kingdom, Asiatic Marianu troops were used in the Middle and New Kingdoms, and the Sherdan, Libyans, and the Naarn were used in the Ramesside period. Chariotry, the backbone of the Egyptian army, was introduced into ancient Egypt from Western Asia at the end of the Second Intermediate Period, the beginning of the New Kingdom. Charioteers were drawn from the upper classes in Egypt. Chariots were generally used as a mobile platform from which to use projectile weapons, and were generally pulled by two horses and manned by two charioteers, a driver who carried a shield, and a man with a bow or javelin. Chariots also had infantry support. By the time of Kadesh, the chariot arm was at the height of its development. It was designed for speed and maneuverability, being lightweight and delicate in appearance. Its offensive power was in its capacity to rapidly turn, wheel and repeatedly charge, penetrating the enemy line and functioning as a mobile firing platform that afforded the fighting crewmen the opportunity to shoot many arrows from the composite bow. The Chariot Corps served as an independent arm but were attached to the Infantry Corps. At Kadesh, there were 25 vehicles per company. Many of the lighter vehicles were retained for scouting and communication duties. In combat, the chariots were deployed in troops of 10, squadrons of 50, and the larger unit was called the Paget, commanded by an officer with the title commander of a chariotry host, and numbering about 250 chariots. Navy. Before the New Kingdom, the Egyptian military was mainly aquatic, and the high ranks were composed of the elite middle class. Egyptian troops were transported by naval vessels as early as the late Old Kingdom. By the later intermediate period, the navy was highly sophisticated, and used complicated naval maneuvers, e.g.,